There is a disturbing truth about human relationships that almost no one wants to admit. The people who disappoint you, the people who betray you, and the people who walk away when you need them most will teach you significantly more about human nature than the people who stay loyal to you ever will. Why? Because loyalty is dangerously easy to misunderstand. Ask yourself a brutal question right now. How many people in your life are actually attached to you? Not to your favors, not to your listening ear, not to your emotional availability, but to you. We naturally assume that when someone remains in our life, it is because they respect us, love us, or value our presence. But depth psychology reveals a far darker reality. Often, people do not stay because they love you. They stay because you are useful. They stay because you listen when others ignore them. They stay because you forgive boundaries that others would strictly enforce. They stay because your empathy acts as a soft cushion for their unexamined flaws. You are their psychological safety net, and as long as you perform that duty, they will call it friendship. They will call it love. And most people go through their entire lives without ever realizing the difference, until a single, sharp act of disappointment forces them to see it. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever noticed how someone's warmth towards you slowly evaporates the exact moment you stop being convenient? Have you ever noticed a friend who suddenly vanishes when your life is going well, but reappears the very second their own life falls apart, and they need a place to dump their psychological trash? Carl Jung, one of the most profound analytical psychologists in history, warned that the single most dangerous illusion human beings carry is the idealization of other people. Notice that Jung did not say human beings are inherently evil. The danger does not come from pure malice. It comes from human desire and psychological laziness. The human mind craves internal consistency. It desperately wants the reality it sees to match the fantasy it hopes for. When someone in your circle demonstrates selfishness, envy, subtle manipulation, or emotional cowardice, your brain faces an immediate, agonizing crisis. Instead of accepting the cold evidence right in front of your eyes, something fascinating and destructive happens. You deny it. You don't deny it because you are stupid. You deny it because accepting the truth forces you to face a far more painful realization. You are never attached to who they actually were. You are attached to who you needed them to be. And that realization destroys the human ego far more painfully than the act of betrayal itself. Most human suffering in relationships does not actually stem from toxic behavior. It stems from the shattered fantasy that those people were supposed to be different. When a friend lies to you, it hurts. But what hurts more is the death of the character you wrote for them in your head. Once your eyes open to this mechanism, you cannot unsee it. You begin seeing it everywhere. Think of the romantic partner who adored you while you were building them up, but resented you the moment you asked for equal emotional support. Think of the family member who celebrates your achievements, but only as long as your success stays small enough not to trigger their hidden insecurities. Yet, when these patterns surface, humanity's default setting is not acceptance. It is negotiation. We negotiate with reality. We sit alone in our rooms at night, replaying text messages, rereading conversations, and telling ourselves soothing lies. Maybe they are just going through a tough phase. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe if I just become more patient, more understanding, more useful, they will finally transform into the person I imagined. But reality operates on cold, unyielding laws. Behavioral patterns will always speak louder than emotional promises. Eventually, life corners you. It strip searches your ideals and forces you to view people without your emotional editing. And that specific moment, painful, quiet, and deeply unsettling, is what Carl Jung referred to as the death of projection. To understand why human betrayal feels so violent, you have to understand what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not merely the dark, violent impulses of humanity. The shadow represents every trait, emotion, desire, and motive that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. It is the envy you pretend you don't feel when your peer succeeds. It is the need for control disguised as caring advice. It is the subtle desire to keep others dependent on you, so you never have to face the fear of abandonment. Most people navigate society firmly convinced that they are good people. They build an elaborate persona of kindness, tolerance, and high morality. But beneath that polished persona, the shadow is constantly running the show behind the curtain. Let us look at a psychological phenomenon that almost no one discusses: the trap of boundaryless kindness. When you practice kindness without boundaries, you think you are displaying virtue. You think you are showing noble selflessness. But in reality, boundaryless kindness quietly trains the people around you on how to exploit you. This truth makes people deeply uncomfortable because it shatters a cherished moral myth, the naive belief that goodness automatically inspires goodness in return. It does not. In many cases, unconditional compliance inspires something far worse. It inspires dependency. It inspires subtle manipulation. And worst of all, it inspires quiet, unspoken contempt. Ask yourself, have you ever noticed how people treat the person who always says yes? They don't treasure them. They utilize them. They push their deadlines onto them. They cancel plans with them at the last minute because they know there will be no consequences. Human beings naturally respect what they cannot easily control. The moment people sense that you fear conflict, that you dread abandonment, or that you will continually over-explain your boundaries instead of enforcing them, the relational dynamic shifts permanently. It rarely happens through conscious villainy. It happens through basic human nature, filling an open void. This brings us to what Jungian psychology calls the unconscious contract. Every single relationship in your life operates on an unspoken, unwritten contract. You might think your friendship is based on shared values or genuine affection, but underneath, there are structural rules that neither of you ever said out loud. For example, the contract might be, I will play the role of the tragic, broken victim, and you will play the role of my endless savior. Or, I will keep my light dim so I don't outshine you, and in return, you will give me a sense of belonging. As long as both parties follow these invisible rules, the relationship feels stable. It feels peaceful. But it is a false peace built on psychological stagnation. This is why disappointment is actually a profound, evolutionary threshold. The precise moment you allow someone to disappoint you without running to fix it, your emotional fantasy dies. You stop demanding that they perform a role in your psychological script. You finally see their behavior for what it is, unedited reality. And once that shift occurs, almost every relationship in your orbit begins to transform. People assume disappointment ruins relationships. The truth is much colder. Disappointment simply reveals the relationship that was already there. The illusion just had the courtesy to die first. What replaces that illusion can feel deeply isolating. When you stop idealizing people, you begin noticing the subtle micro-behaviors you previously chose to ignore. You notice how certain friends only exhibit warmth when they feel they are losing access to your energy. You notice how subtle put-downs and passive-aggressive jokes disguised as teasing are actually masked envy. You notice how entire friendships were built on an asymmetrical dynamic. You provided emotional labor, crisis management, and steady presence, while they provided occasional, conditional availability. At first, these realizations feel bitter. They make you want to retreat from the world. But this bitterness is not cynicism. It is the pain of innocence leaving your psychological system. It is the birth of an adult consciousness that is no longer easy to deceive. There is a psychological phenomenon that almost everyone experiences during personal evolution, yet very few truly understand. People do not resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. Let that settle into your mind for a moment. When you begin to heal, when you establish firm boundaries, when you stop begging for validation, and when you become emotionally self-sufficient, the social ecosystem around you experiences a seismic disruption. Why? Because human social circles function like dynamic equilibrium systems. Everyone has their assigned place in the puzzle. If you have spent years being the fixer, the pleaser, the quiet one, or the dependable one who accepts breadcrumbs, people have organized their lives around your predictability. The moment you start evolving, you break that invisible contract. Suddenly, your healthy boundaries are interpreted as arrogance. Your calm silence is perceived as hostility. Your independence is viewed as a personal attack. Have you ever experienced this? You start working on yourself. You start setting goals, cutting out bad habits, or refusing to participate in toxic gossip. And instead of your closest circle cheering you on, you feel a cold, subtle pushback. Sarcastic comments start appearing. "Oh, you're too good for us now?" Or, "Look who suddenly changed. Why does this happen? Why would the people who claim to love you feel threatened by your improvement?" Carl Jung explained that most people prefer the version of you that keeps them psychologically comfortable. They love the version of you that agrees with them. They love the version of you that remains insecure. They love the version of you that stays small enough, never to trigger their own sense of stagnation. When you evolve, your progress acts as an uncomfortably bright mirror, reflecting their unfulfilled potential. Your growth reminds them of the goals they abandoned, the discipline they lack, and the lives they are failing to lead. And because facing their own failure requires painful self-awareness and hard work, their ego chooses a much easier defense mechanism. They turn against you. Notice how this resistance manifests. It is rarely an outright dramatic confrontation. Instead, it appears as psychological sabotage. First, increased sarcasm aimed at your new habits or goals. Second, a sudden withdrawal of affection or subtle silent treatment when you enforce a boundary. Third, subtle attempts to drag you back into old, destructive environments under the guise of remembering the good old days. And fourth, rewriting history to frame your personal growth as changing for the worse. Human beings will prioritize the defense of their identity over the acceptance of truth almost every single time. If acknowledging your growth forces them to admit their own complacency, they will gladly sacrifice the relationship to protect their fragile self-image. After the initial shock of betrayal and disappointment passes, a distinct new phase arrives, a phase marked by an eerie, internal silence. This is not the loud, angry silence of a fight. It is not the spiteful silence of someone planning revenge. It is the absolute quiet that occurs when you simply stop asking why. You stop reviewing old text messages looking for hidden clues. You stop rehearsing imaginary arguments in your shower. You stop trying to rehabilitate the polished image you once held of them. You just stop. And ironically, this quiet clarity often feels more uncomfortable than the original betrayal. Why? Because the human ego survives on narrative and drama. As long as you are actively hurt, furious, or searching for answers, a part of you is still emotionally invested in the dynamic. Anger is not separation. Anger is still a form of intense attachment. Passionate hatred means they still occupy primary real estate in your mind. The arrival of true acceptance brings a cold, unfiltered clarity. With this clarity comes a realization that reshapes your perspective on human connection forever. Certain people were never attached to you as a human being. They were attached to their access to your assets. They were attached to access to your listening ear when they were lonely. They were attached to access to your unearned forgiveness when they messed up. They were attached to access to your energy when their own world felt dark. They were attached to access to the status, convenience, or comfort your presence provided. The moment you alter the terms of that access, the moment you close the door to one-sided emotional draining, their behavior changes instantly. The warmth turns to ice. The calls stop. The connection vanishes. Idealistic, highly empathetic people suffer immensely from this realization because they operate under the misguided belief that continuous effort guarantees loyalty. They think, if I just give a little more, if I am just a little more patient, they will realize my value. But in dysfunctional dynamics, Effort does not build loyalty. It merely increases consumption. The more you give without condition, the more your sacrifice becomes normalized, until your presence is no longer valued. It is merely expected. This is the absolute core of Jungian shadow work. Shadow work is not about fighting the monsters outside your house. It is about confronting the uncomfortable truth of why you left your door unlocked in the first place. You must sit in the silence and ask yourself the ultimate, terrifying question. Why was I so desperate to be loved by someone who demonstrated, over and over again, that they were incapable of seeing me clearly? What hole inside of me was I trying to fill by earning the approval of someone who disrespects me? When you answer those questions honestly, the game changes forever. You stop blaming them for being snakes, and you start examining why you kept walking through the tall grass barefoot. Carl Jung defined the ultimate goal of human psychological development as individuation, the process by which an individual becomes a truly integrated, autonomous self, completely free from the social projections, manipulative guilt, and external expectations of others. Individuation does not begin when you achieve grand public success, win awards, or receive praise. Individuation begins in the quiet wreckage of shattered expectations. It begins when you learn to observe human behavior without immediately projecting your unfulfilled emotional needs onto it. When you reach this level of psychological maturity, your entire relationship with disappointment transforms completely. You no longer take human inconsistency personally. You stop expecting permanent loyalty from temporary visitors. You stop mistaking surface charm for deep character. And most importantly, you stop trying to heal individuals who are deeply committed to remaining broken. You come to understand that forgiveness is not about sentimental reconciliation or pretending the damage never happened. True forgiveness is colder, cleaner, and infinitely more powerful. Forgiveness is simply the complete surrender of your demand that the past should have been different. You do not forgive people so they can re-enter your life and repeat the same toxic cycles. You forgive them so that their memory no longer holds equity in your mind. You forgive them so you can reclaim the emotional bandwidth they were stealing. From this point forward, you navigate the world with a completely different posture. You become far harder to manipulate, not because you have built bitter walls or become cruel, but because you have developed psychological pattern recognition. You see people exactly as they are, not as you hope they will become. And that is where true peace resides. Peace does not come from living in a fairy tale world where everyone is good, honest, and loyal. Peace comes from looking directly at human nature, in all its selfishness, complexity, and shadow, and realizing that you no longer need anyone to fake who they are, just to keep you emotionally comfortable. You become immune to the fear of being abandoned, because you realize you will never abandon yourself again. If you have made it to this point in the video, it means you have likely survived a disappointment that forced you to grow up faster than you ever intended. Look back at that pain today, not with regret, but with gratitude for the clarity it bought you. Leave a comment below sharing the single realization or disappointment that permanently changed how you view human nature. Your story might be the exact lesson someone else needs to read today. If this message resonated with your journey, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who is currently navigating the silence of clarity. Until next time, stop editing reality to fit your fantasies